12 sons. A single man fathered 12 sons, and from those 12 sons, 12 tribes were born, and from those 12 tribes, an entire nation was born that changed the history of humanity forever. But here is what no one tells you. Of those 12 tribes, 10 simply disappeared. They vanished. They're swallowed by history as if they had never existed. Entire empires were mobilized to destroy them. Kings signed decrees to erase them from memory. And most disturbingly, even today, more than 2,700 years later, no one knows for sure where they went. There are theories that place descendants of these lost tribes in Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Japan, and even among the indigenous peoples of the Americas. How is it possible for millions of people to simply evaporate from the map? And more importantly, why did God allow the nation he himself chose to be torn apart in this way? To understand what happened to the 12 tribes, we need to go back to the beginning. And the beginning is not an army. It is not a kingdom. It is not even a village. The beginning is a family, and deeply dysfunctional family at that. We are around 1800 BC. The place is the land of Canaan, a narrow strip of land between the Mediterranean Sea and the desert, cut by mountains, valleys, and dry wadis. And in this land lives a man named Jacob. Jacob is the grandson of Abraham, the same one to whom God promised that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky. Genesis 22:17 records this promise. But looking at Jacob's life, you would never guess that a nation would come from him. Because Jacob's story begins with betrayal. Jacob deceived his own brother Esau to steal the birthright blessing. He deceived his father Isaac, who was old and blind, by pretending to be his brother. And because of that, he had to flee from home, because Esau swore to kill him. Jacob spent 20 years away from his family, working for his uncle Laban, who, by a twist of historical irony, was just as deceptive as he was. Laban promised his daughter Rachel in marriage, in exchange for 7 years of work. Jacob worked the 7 years, and on the wedding night, Laban swapped Rachel for her older sister Leah under the veil. Jacob woke up in the morning, married to the wrong woman. Genesis 29 narrates this episode with a cruel detail. The same man who deceived his blind father was deceived in the darkness, and it is exactly from this family mess that the 12 tribes are born. Jacob ended up married to 2 sisters, Leah and Rachel, and also had children with 2 concubines, Zilpah and Bilhah. 4 women, 12 sons, and a fierce rivalry between them. Leah was the rejected wife. The Bible says bluntly that Jacob did not love her. Genesis 29:31 says that when the Lord saw that Leah was hated, he opened her womb, meaning she began to have children while Rachel, the favorite, remained barren. And the names Leah gave to her children reveal the pain she carried. The first, Reuben, a son, because she believed that now her husband would love her. The second, Simeon, the Lord heard that I am hated. The third, Levi, now my husband will become attached to me. Each name is a cry from a woman begging for attention. Rachel, furious with jealousy for not having children, sent her concubine Bilhah to lie with Jacob, and Bilhah had Dan and Naphtali. Leah responded by sending her concubine Zilpah, and Gad and Asher were born. Then Leah had more children, Issachar, Zebulun, and a daughter Dinah. And finally, after years of waiting, Rachel conceived. Joseph was born, and much later Benjamin, the last son, whose mother died in childbirth. Pay close attention to this detail. 12 sons, 4 different mothers, a house full of jealousy, favoritism, and resentment. This is not a holy family living in harmony. It is a powdercade. And the explosion was coming. Because Jacob committed the same mistake his parents did, he chose a favorite, Joseph, the first son of Rachel, the woman he loved. Jacob gave Joseph a special tunic. The Hebrew text says, ketonet pasim, which was likely a long garment with sleeves, made of fine dyed fabric. In a world where clothes defined social status, that was a slap in the face to the other 11 brothers. It was like saying, "This is my heir. You are supporting characters." And Joseph did not help. At 17, he had dreams where sheaves of wheat and stars bowed down to him. He told his brothers about it. Genesis 37-8 records their reaction. "Will you indeed reign over us?" The hatred grew until it became unbearable. One day, Jacob sent Joseph to check on how his brothers were tending the flocks near Shechem. Joseph went. And when the brothers saw him coming from afar, that colorful tunic visible from miles away, they made a decision. Let's kill him. Reuben, the firstborn, convinced the others not to shed blood. They threw Joseph into an empty cistern, but while Reuben was away, Judah had another idea. Why kill our brother? Let's sit him. And that is what they did. They sold their own brother to Midianite merchants for 20 pieces of silver. Then they killed a goat, dipped the tunic in the blood, and took it to their father. "We found this. See if it belongs to your son." Jacob recognized it, and Genesis 37:34 says that he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for days. No one could comfort him. Now think about what just happened. The future patriarchs of the 12 tribes of Israel, the founding fathers of a nation that God chose to carry his covenant, they just committed human trafficking against their own brother, and they lied to their father. This is the DNA of the tribes. It does not start with glory. It starts with betrayal, envy, and goat's blood on a stolen tunic. If this shocked you, leave a like now so more people can know this story as it really is. Joseph ended up in Egypt. And what happened to him there is one of the greatest turnarounds in the Bible, from slave to governor of the most powerful nation in the world. But you probably already know that part. What matters here is what happened after. A brutal famine hit the entire region. Canaan dried up, the herds died, and Jacob's sons, desperate, went down to Egypt to buy grain. And there, without knowing it, they knelt before Joseph, who was now the second most powerful man in Egypt. The dream of the sheaves of wheat bowing down was fulfilled to the letter. Joseph revealed himself. There was weeping, reconciliation, and Jacob went down to Egypt with the whole family. Genesis 46:27 tells the exact number, 70 people, 70. Remember that number, because from those 70 people, millions will be born. This is where Jacob's family stops being a family and begins to become a people. They settled in the land of Goshen, a fertile region in the Nile Delta, abundant pasture, fresh water, rich soil, perfect for shepherds. And for a time, everything went well. Joseph had prestige, the family prospered, but Joseph died. And after him, a pharaoh rose to the throne who did not know Joseph. Exodus 1:8 marks this turn with a short and devastating phrase, a new king who did not know or did not care what Joseph had done for Egypt. And what this pharaoh saw terrified him, because the Hebrews had multiplied explosively. Exodus 1:7 says that the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied and waxed exceeding mighty, and the land was filled with them, from 70 to hundreds of thousands in about 400 years. Pharaoh decided that this was a threat. If a war broke out, that massive population could ally with the enemy. So he did what empires always do when they fear a growing minority: slavery, forced labor, building store cities like Pithom and Ramesses, bricks of mud mixed with straw, under the scorching sun of the Egyptian desert. And when that was not enough to contain the growth, came the most brutal order. Every newborn Hebrew boy must be thrown into the Nile. It is in this scenario of genocide that the tribes are forged, not in freedom, in captivity, not in temples, in construction sites. For 430 years, according to Exodus 12:40, the descendants of Jacob lived in Egypt. And during that time, something crucial happened. They stopped being a family and organized themselves by tribes. Each group of descendants of each son of Jacob maintained its identity. Reuben with Reuben, Judah with Judah, Benjamin with Benjamin. And then came Moses, the plagues, the Exodus, the night the angel of death passed over Egypt, and every firstborn died, except in the houses marked with the blood of the Lamb. The sea opened, and suddenly a people who only knew slavery are free in the Sinai desert, looking back and seeing the dust of the most powerful army on earth being swallowed by the water. But here is the problem no one mentions. You just freed between 600,000 and 2 million people. The number depends on the interpretation of Exodus 12:37, and threw them all into the desert. No city, no government, no law, no infrastructure, no stored food. It's like emptying an entire metropolis and dropping everyone in the middle of nowhere. How do you organize that? The answer is by the tribes, and it is in the Sinai desert that the tribal structure becomes official, military, and sacred. Numbers chapter 2 describes with surgical precision how the tribes camped around the tabernacle, the sacred tent that housed the Ark of the Covenant. It was not random. It was a military and religious formation at the same time. Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun to the east, in the vanguard position, and it is no coincidence that Judah, the royal tribe, was on the side where the sun rises. Reuben, Simeon, and Gad to the south. Ephraim, Manasseh, and Benjamin to the west. Dan, Asher, and Naphtali to the north. And in the absolute center of it all, the Levites, the tribe of Levi, who received no territory because their inheritance was God himself. They took care of the tabernacle, the sacrifices, the music, and the teaching of the law. Now notice them. I said 12 tribes, but I listed 13 names. This is because Joseph did not become one tribe. He became two. His sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, were adopted by Jacob on his deathbed in Genesis 48, and each received the status of a full tribe. And Levi, being the priestly tribe, was set apart and did not count in the territorial division. So the number 12 is maintained, but the composition changes depending on the context, military, territorial, or ceremonial. And here something fascinating enters. Numbers chapter 1 brings the first census in history recorded in the Bible, a military census counting every man over 20 years old, fit for war. The total, 603,550 combatants, not counting women, children, the elderly, and Levites. We are talking about an army the size of some powers of the ancient world, and they didn't even have a country yet. The desert lasted 40 years. An entire generation was born and died in the sands of Sinai. And during those 40 years, the tribes received something that transformed a band of former slaves into a people with an identity. The law. 613 commandments, rules for everything, from how to worship God to how to treat an ox that fell into a ditch. Rules of hygiene, justice, property, marriage, war, and food. The Torah was not just religion. It was a constitution, a civil code, and a penal code all in one package. And each tribe was responsible for teaching and obeying this law within its own clan. If you believe that this level of organization in the middle of the desert can only be the work of something greater than man, comment, only God. But living in the desert was not the plan. The plan was Canaan, the land that God had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, a land that, at that moment, was occupied by dozens of different peoples: Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites, cities fortified with stone walls, armies with chariots and iron weapons, and the Israelites were still using bronze. Taking that land would not be diplomacy. It would be total war. Moses died before entering. Command passed to Joshua from the tribe of Ephraim, an important detail because Joshua was not from Judah. Military leadership was not in the tribe that would later be the royal tribe. This shows that at this stage, the tribes still operated as a confederation. There was no king, There was no capital. Unity came from shared faith in the law and from a charismatic leader everyone respected. The conquest of Canaan began with Jericho, and Jericho was a test of faith disguised as a battle, because the military plan was not a military plan. It was a religious procession, marching around the walls for 7 days, blowing trumpets, and on the seventh day, shouting. Joshua 6 describes what happened. The walls collapsed. And here is an impressive archaeological fact. Excavations at Tel es Sultan, the site identified as Jericho, found evidence of walls that collapsed outward, not inward. When an army knocks down a wall with battering rams, it falls inward. These fell outward. Archaeologists debate the dates and causes, but the pattern of destruction is unusual. After Jericho came Ai. After Ai, the southern campaign, then the northern campaign. Joshua chapters 10 to 12 list 31 defeated kings. 31. In a matter of years, the power structure of Canaan was demolished. And then came the most important moment for the tribes, the division of the land. Joshua chapters 13 to 21 detail, lot by lot, which tribe got which territory. And this division was not random. It reflected hierarchies, ancient promises, and even punishments. Judah received the largest territory, the entire southern mountainous region, including Hebron, the city where Abraham was buried, and extending to the Negev desert. It was the most numerous tribe and already carried the prophetic blessing of Jacob, who in Genesis 49:10 declared, "The scepter shall not depart from Judah." Translation: from this tribe, kings would come. Ephraim and Manasseh, the two tribes of Joseph, got the fertile heart of Canaan, the central hills, with irrigated valleys and excellent agricultural lands. It was a recognition of Joseph's role as the savior of the family. Benjamin received a narrow but strategic strip between Judah and Ephraim, including the place that would one day be called Jerusalem. At the time, it was a Jebusite fortress called Jebus, and no tribe managed to take it. It sat there like a splinter on the map for more than 200 years. Dan received territory on the coast but could not conquer it. The Philistines were too strong, so part of the tribe of Dan migrated to the far north and took the city of Laish, renaming it Dan. Judges chapter 18 tells this story, and it is not pretty. It involved the theft of idols and the kidnapping of a priest. Simeon was embedded within the territory of Judah in the south. Over time, this tribe was absorbed by Judah and practically lost its independent identity. Some scholars point out that this was a consequence of Jacob's curse in Genesis 49:7. "I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel," a punishment for the massacre of Shechem that Simeon and Levi committed decades earlier. Zebulun and Issachar were in the Jezreel Valley, one of the most fertile regions in the land of Israel, and also one of the most vulnerable. The valley was a natural trade and military route, which meant these tribes were always in the way of any invading army. Naphtali and Asher were in the far north, in the mountains of Galilee and the coastal strip of Lebanon. Gad and Reuben did something different from everyone else. They asked to stay on the east side of the Jordan River, in Transjordan. Numbers 32 records that Moses was furious with the request. He thought it was cowardice, that they were abandoning their brothers. But Gad and Reuben argued, "The land is good for livestock, and we have many cattle." They promised to cross the Jordan to fight alongside the other tribes in the conquest, and only then would they return to the east. And that is what they did. But this geographical separation, tribes on the east side of the Jordan away from the others, planted a seed of division that was never healed. And Levi? Levi did not receive contiguous territory. They received 48 cities scattered across all the tribes. Joshua 21 lists each one. The logic was brilliant. The Levites, as priests and teachers of the law, needed to be everywhere. They were the spiritual glue that kept the tribes together. Without them, each tribe would have isolated itself and created its own version of religion. Now stop and look at the map. This is what you have. 12 tribes scattered over a territory the size of a small state, each with its land, its leader, its interests, its rivalries. There is no king, there is no capital, there is no unified permanent army. The only thing that unites these tribes is the Ark of the Covenant, which stayed in Shiloh in the territory of Ephraim, and the religious festivals that 3 times a year brought representatives from all the tribes together. Did this work? For a while. But the period that followed was the bloodiest, most chaotic, and most brutal in Israel's history, and it almost destroyed the tribes before they could become a nation. The period of the Judges. Judges chapter 2, verses 16 to 19, summarizes it all in a vicious cycle that repeated for over 300 years. The people abandoned God. God allowed an enemy to oppress them. The people cried out for help. God raised up a judge, a military and spiritual leader, who defeated the enemy. The people obeyed again. The judge died, and the people abandoned God once more. This cycle turned at least 12 times, each time worse, each time more violent, each time more distant from what that nation was supposed to be. And notice, the judges were not kings. They had no permanent authority. They did not rule all the tribes. Most led only 1 or 2 tribes at a time, resolving local crises. Othniel, the first judge, was from Judah. Ehud, who assassinated the Moabite king Eglon with a dagger hidden on his right thigh, was from Benjamin. Deborah, the only woman among the judges, judged under a palm tree in territory of Ephraim, and when she summoned the tribes to fight against Sisera, the Canaanite general who had 900 iron chariots, not all of them came. Judges chapter 5 is brutal on this point. Deborah's song praises the tribes that came to fight: Ephraim, Benjamin, Manasseh, Zebulun, Issachar, and Naphtali. But then she names those who did not come. Reuben stayed debating among themselves, sitting among the sheepfolds, listening to the bleating of the flocks. Gilead, that is Gad, stayed on the other side of the Jordan. Dan remained on the ships. Asher sat on the coast. It is a public denunciation sung in the form of poetry. Deborah is saying, "While your brothers were dying on the battlefield, you stayed home counting sheep." This refusal of tribes to help each other is the cancer that will rot Israel from the inside. Each tribe thinking of itself, each tribe calculating if it is worth fighting for the other. The Confederation worked in theory, but in practice it was as fragile as glass. Gideon came from Manasseh. With 300 men and torches hidden inside clay jars, he defeated a Midianite army so large that Judges 7:12 compares it to locusts. Innumerable. When the battle was over, the tribe of Ephraim was furious. Not because they lost, but because they weren't called first. Ephraim had an ego the size of its territory. They were the tribe of Joshua, the tribe that kept the tabernacle in Shiloh, and they considered themselves the natural leaders of the Confederation. Gideon appeased the fight with diplomacy, but remember that name, Ephraim, because this pride will explode later with devastating consequences. After Gideon came Abimelech, his son, who murdered 70 of his own brothers to proclaim himself king in Shechem. Judges 9 tells this story as a warning of what happens when ambition replaces a calling. Abimelech died in a humiliating way. A woman threw a millstone from the wall and cracked his skull. He asked his armor-bearer to kill him with a sword, so they wouldn't say a woman killed him. But they said it anyway. 3,000 years later, they are still saying it. Jephthah from Gilead defeated the Ammonites, but paid a terrible price for a reckless vow. And when Ephraim once again complained that they hadn't been called to the fight, Jephthah did not have Gideon's patience. There was war between Gilead and Ephraim. And Judges 12 records one of the most sinister episodes in the Bible. The men of Gilead took the fords of the Jordan. When someone tried to cross, they asked, "Say Shibboleth." The Ephraimites could not pronounce the Esh. They said Sibboleth. and everyone who got it wrong was killed on the spot. 42,000 Ephraimites died in that phonetic test, tribe against tribe, brother against brother, and all over wounded pride. Samson was from Dan, the strongest man who ever lived according to the biblical account, and also the most undisciplined. Samson fought alone against the Philistines, not at the head of an army, but as a lone vigilante motivated by personal revenge. He burned crops, killed 1,000 men with the jawbone of a donkey, ripped off the gates of a city, and carried them on his shoulders. But he never united the tribes. He never led an organized campaign, and in the end, blind and chained, trapped in a Philistine temple, he died by pulling down the pillars upon himself and 3,000 Philistines. Judges 16:30 says, he killed more in his death than in his life. A tragic hero of a tribe that was already adrift. And if Samson represents individual failure, what comes next represents collective failure. Judges chapters 19 to 21 tell the most disturbing story in the entire Hebrew Bible. A Levite traveling with his concubine stopped in the city of Gibeah in the territory of Benjamin. At night, men from the city surrounded the house and demanded that the Levite be handed over to be raped. The host refused, and the Levite pushed his concubine out. She was raped all night long. In the morning, he found her collapsed at the door, dead. What he did next is hard to describe. He cut her body into 12 pieces and sent one piece to each tribe, a summons to war made with human flesh. The tribes gathered, 400,000 combatants, and demanded that Benjamin hand over the culprits. Benjamin refused, and a civil war began. The other 11 tribes against one. 2 battles, and Benjamin won both. 40,000 Israelites died, but in the third battle Benjamin was crushed. The entire tribe was almost exterminated. 600 men were left. Judges 20:46 says that 25,000 Benjamites died in a single day. And after the carnage, the tribes realized what they had done. They had almost erased one of the 12 tribes, and they had sworn not to give their daughters in marriage to Benjamin. To save the tribe from extinction, they invented solutions that border on the absurd. They authorized the 600 survivors to kidnap women during a religious festival in Shiloh. Judges 21:25 ends this story with the phrase that summarizes the entire period. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. This phrase is repeated 4 times in the book of Judges. It is the epitaph of an era. Without central authority, without unified justice, the tribes were devouring each other, and the people began to look at the neighboring nations. Moab had a king, Ammon had a king, the Philistines had their lords, and they said, "We want a king too." The demand reached Samuel, the last of the judges, a prophet respected by all the tribes, and Samuel's reaction was to 1 Samuel 8:7 records that God said to Samuel, "They have not rejected you. They have rejected me as their king." But God told him to grant the request, and he gave a warning. The king will take your sons for the army, your daughters for the kitchen, your lands for his officials, 1/10 of everything you produce. And when you cry out, God will not answer. The people heard all this and said, "It doesn't matter. We want a king anyway." And God chose the most unlikely king possible, Saul, from the tribe of Benjamin, that tribe, the one that was almost exterminated in the civil war, the smallest of all. Saul was literally from the smallest tribe, from the smallest clan within that tribe. 1 Samuel 9:21 records Saul's own surprise. "Am I not a Benjamite, of the smallest of the tribes of Israel?" It was as if God were making a statement. Monarchy is not about tribal merit. It is about divine choice. And Saul had the appearance. 1 Samuel 9:2 says he was the tallest in all Israel, from the waist up, taller than any other man. In a culture where physical presence meant leadership, Saul looked like a movie king. But looking like a king and being a king are very different things. In the beginning, It worked. Saul united the tribes against the Ammonites at Jabesh Gilead and won overwhelmingly. The tribes, for the first time in generations, marched together under a single command. But Saul began to crumble. He offered sacrifices that only the priest could offer, because he was impatient. He made a foolish oath that almost cost the life of his own son, Jonathan. And when God ordered the total destruction of the Amalekites, every person, every animal, Saul spared King Agag and the best of the flocks. 1 Samuel 15:23 brings the sentence, "Rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king." And while Saul was still on the throne, God had already chosen the replacement, a teenage shepherd from the tribe of Judah. A boy no one took seriously. Not even his own father called him when Samuel came to his house looking for the next king. David, the youngest, the ruddy one, the one who played the harp to soothe Saul's tormented spirits without knowing that one day he would take his throne. David killed Goliath with a stone and a sling and became a national hero overnight. But the years that followed were years of flight. Saul, consumed by jealousy and paranoia, hunted David through the desert like an animal. David lived in caves, led a band of 400 indebted and desperate men, and on 2 occasions had the chance to kill Saul, and did not do it. 1 Samuel 24 and 26 record these moments. David cut the hem of Saul's robe in the darkness of a cave, and then felt remorse for having touched the Lord's anointed. Saul died in the Battle of Mount Gilboa, along with 3 sons, including Jonathan, David's best friend. The Philistines hung the bodies on the wall of Bethshan, and when the news arrived, David did not celebrate. He wept. He wrote a lament that is in 2 Samuel 1, one of the most beautiful texts in ancient literature. But Saul's death did not mean unity. It meant civil war. Judah immediately crowned David in Hebron. But the northern tribes, led by Abner, Saul's general, crowned Ishbosheth, Saul's son, as a rival king. 2 kings, 2 kingdoms. The crack that existed from the beginning, south against north, Judah against Ephraim, was now official. The war lasted more than 7 years. 2 Samuel 3:1 summarizes, "There was long war between the house of Saul and the house David. David grew stronger and stronger, and the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker." Ishbosheth was murdered by 2 of his own captains. They brought the head to David, expecting a reward. David had them executed. And finally, 2 Samuel 5:3 records the moment. All the elders of all the tribes came to Hebron and anointed David as king over all Israel. He was 30 years old. He had waited more than a decade since his secret anointing by Samuel, and the first thing David did as unified king was a stroke of political genius. He conquered Jerusalem, a Jebusite fortress that no tribe had managed to take in over 200 years. And the choice was surgical. Jerusalem was on the border between Judah and Benjamin, but belonged to no tribe. It was neutral ground. By establishing his capital there, David avoided tribal jealousy. It was not the capital of Judah. It was not the capital of Ephraim. It was the capital of Israel, the city of David. 2 Samuel 5:9 marks the foundation. Then he brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, dancing before it with such intensity that his wife Michal despised him through the window. But David was not putting on a show. He was merging political power and religious authority in a single place. Jerusalem was now the seat of the throne and the dwelling place of God. No other city in the ancient world carried this double weight. David expanded the kingdom like no Israeli leader before him. He defeated the Philistines definitively. He conquered Moab, Ammon, Edom, and parts of Syria. 2 Samuel 8 lists victory after victory. David's kingdom stretched from the river of Egypt to the Euphrates, exactly the borders God had promised Abraham in Genesis 15:18. For the first and only time in history, the territorial promise was completely fulfilled. But David was a man of war, and God said to him, "You will not build the temple. You have shed too much blood. That privilege will belong to your son." 1 Chronicles 22:8 records these words, and the son was Solomon, the man who would inherit the largest kingdom Israel had ever known, and plant the seeds of its destruction. Solomon started well. When God offered him anything he asked for, Solomon asked for wisdom. 1 Kings 3:9, "Give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people." God was so impressed that he gave him wisdom and wealth and honor. Solomon became legendary. Kings and queens came from afar to hear him. The Queen of Sheba traveled more than 2,000 kilometers from southern Arabia to test his wisdom with riddles, and left saying that not half had been told to her. And Solomon built the temple. 7 years of construction, 180,000 workers, according to 1 Kings 5:13-16. Cedars of Lebanon, stones cut in underground quarries so that no sound of a hammer was heard at the holy site. Gold lining the inner walls. Cherubim 15 feet tall, guarding the Holy of Holies. When the Ark of the Covenant was placed inside and the priests came out, a cloud filled the temple. God's presence was so dense that no one could stand up. But here is where the story turns, because Solomon did not build just the temple. He built a palace that took 13 years, almost double the temple. He built store cities, fortifications, stables for horses. And to finance all this, he did something that echoed the warning Samuel had given the people decades earlier. He imposed forced labor on the northern tribes. 1 Kings 5:13 says he recruited 30,000 men from all Israel for shifts of forced labor in the forest of Lebanon, 1 month in Lebanon, 2 months at home. And who supervised this work? A man named Jeroboam from the tribe of Ephraim. Remember that name, Jeroboam, because he will split Israel in half. Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. 1 Kings 11:3. It was not debauchery, it was diplomacy. Each marriage sealed an alliance with a neighboring nation, but these women brought their gods. And Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived, began to build altars for Ashtoreth, Chemosh, and Moloch on the hills around Jerusalem. The same king who built the house of God now built houses for the gods that demanded child sacrifice. God spoke. 1 Kings 11:11. "Since you have done this and have not kept my covenant, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and give it to your servant, not the whole kingdom." God would preserve one tribe under the line of David because of the promise, but the rest, 10 tribes, would be torn away. Solomon died around 930 BC, and everything David had built was about to collapse in a single assembly. Rehoboam, Solomon's son, traveled to Shechem to be crowned. Notice the choice of place. Not Jerusalem, Shechem, the heart of Ephraim's territory, the city where Abraham built the first altar in the Promised Land, city where Joshua renewed the covenant. If Rehoboam wanted to be king of all Israel, he had to go north and ask for approval, and the north had conditions. The northern tribes sent for Jeroboam, that Ephraimite who had supervised Solomon's forced labor and then fled to Egypt when Solomon tried to kill him. Jeroboam returned and stood before Rehoboam as the spokesman for the north. The request was simple. 1 Kings 12:4. "Your father made our yoke heavy. Now, therefore, lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke which he put on us, and we will serve you. Lower the taxes, reduce the forced labor, treat us like brothers, not like slaves." Rehoboam asked for 3 days to think. The old advisers who had served Solomon said, "Yield, speak gently. If you serve this people today, they will serve you forever." The young advisers, who had grown up with Rehoboam in palace luxury, said the opposite. 1 Kings 12:11 records the advice. "My father loaded you with a heavy yoke, but I will add to your yoke. My father scourged you with whips, but I will scourge you with scorpions." Scorpions were whips with metal tips. Rehoboam chose the young men. When the northern tribes heard the answer, the reaction was immediate. 1 Kings 12:16. What portion have we in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. It is a cry of secession, a declaration of independence. And it was not new. It was the same phrase that Sheba, son of Bichri, had shouted in the revolt against David decades earlier. The crack had always been there. Rehoboam just turned it into an abyss. Rehoboam still tried. He sent Adoram, the head of forced labor, to negotiate. The northern tribes stoned Adoram to death. Rehoboam fled to Jerusalem in a chariot. He tried to gather 180,000 warriors from Judah and Benjamin to reconquer the north by force. But the prophet Shemaiah brought a message from God. You shall not go up or fight against your brothers. Let every man return to his house, for this thing is from me. And the kingdom split, 10 tribes to the north under Jeroboam, 2 to the south, Judah and Benjamin, under Rehoboam. The year was approximately 930 BC. David's dream lasted 40 years under Solomon, and it ended in a single assembly because of an arrogant prince who preferred whips to words. If one man's arrogance was capable of tearing apart what God built, comment, pride destroys. Jeroboam was now king of the north, and he had a theological problem. 3 times a year, every Israelite man was supposed to go to the temple in Jerusalem for the feasts, Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. But Jerusalem was in the south, in Rehoboam's territory. If the people of the north continued pilgrimaging to Jerusalem, political loyalty would eventually return to the house of David, and Jeroboam made the most destructive calculation in Israel's history. 1 Kings 12:28. It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Behold your gods, O Israel, which brought you up out of the land of Egypt. He had 2 golden calves made. He placed one in Dan in the far north, another in Bethel, at the southern end of his territory. He created priests from any tribe, not just Levites. He changed the date of the Feast of Tabernacles from the 7th to the 8th month. He built an entire alternative religious system. The phrase "made Israel to sin" appears linked to Jeroboam's name more than 20 times in the books of Kings. Every northern king after him is judged by the same standard. He walked in the ways of Jeroboam. He did not just divide the kingdom, he divided the faith. What follows in books of Kings is a parade of instability in the north and relative stability in the south, and the numbers tell the story. The northern kingdom, called Israel, or sometimes Ephraim, lasted about 210 years. In that period, it had 19 kings from 9 different dynasties. No family managed to stay on the throne for more than 4 generations. 8 of these kings were murdered. 1 committed suicide. Violence was the mechanism of succession. Meanwhile, the southern kingdom, called Judah, lasted about 340 years. It had 20 kings, all from the line of David, a single dynasty for more than 3 centuries. There were terrible kings, like Manasseh, who reigned 55 years and filled Jerusalem with blood. But there were kings like Hezekiah and Josiah, who tried deep reforms. God's promise to David held the line of Judah, crooked, stained, but unbreakable. In the north, the most important dynasty was that of Omri. You have probably never heard of him. The Bible dedicates only 6 verses to his reign in 1 Kings 16, but Assyrian records called Israel the land Omri for more than a century after his death. Omri did something that changed the geopolitics of the region. He built Samaria, a new capital on a hill bought for 2 talents of silver, strategically positioned, heavily fortified. Samaria would become synonymous with the northern kingdom, and Omri sealed an alliance with Phoenicia by marrying his son Ahab to a Phoenician princess named Jezebel. That name, if there is a name that carries more negative weight in the entire Bible, it is hard to find. Jezebel did not come alone. She brought 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah. She brought an entire religion in her marriage dowry. Ahab built a temple for Baal in Samaria. 1 Kings 16:33 says he did more to provoke the Lord's anger than all the kings of Israel before him. And it was against Ahab and Jezebel that God raised up the most dramatic of prophets, Elijah. The confrontation at Mount Carmel is one of the most cinematic scenes in the entire Bible. Elijah against 450 prophets of Baal, 2 altars, 2 sacrifices. The God who answers with fire is the true God. The prophets of Baal danced, shouted, and cut themselves with knives from morning until afternoon. Nothing. Elijah mocked them. Cry aloud, for he is a god. Either he is meditating, or he is busy, or he is on a journey, or perhaps he is sleeping and must be awakened. Then Elijah soaked the altar with water, 12 jars, so much water that it filled the trench around it, and prayed a single prayer. Fire fell from heaven. It consumed the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, the dust, and licked up the water in the trench. 1 Kings 18:39, the people fell on their faces and said, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." But miracles do not change systems. Jezebel swore to kill Elijah, and he fled to the desert. The same prophet who faced 450 men now ran from one woman. In the desert, he asked to die. God did not rebuke him. He sent food and water, and then spoke to him, not in earthquake, not in the fire, but in a still, small voice. Elijah was not alone. God said he had 7,000 in Israel who had not bowed the knee to Baal. 7,000 in a kingdom of hundreds of thousands. The remnant was small, but it existed. And this idea of a remnant, a faithful group within an unfaithful nation, will become one of the most important doctrines of biblical theology. God was never without witnesses. Ahab died in a battle at Ramoth-Gilead. He had disguised himself so enemies wouldn't find him, but an arrow shot at random, the Hebrew text says in its innocence, without aiming at anyone specific, hit between the joints of his armor. Ahab bled slowly on the floor of the chariot. When they washed the chariot in the pool of Samaria, dogs licked the blood, exactly as Elijah had prophesied. Jezebel survived her husband for more than a decade, but when Jehu, anointed by a disciple of Elisha, rode to Jezreel to take the throne, Jezebel painted her eyes, arranged her hair, and looked out the window. She was not seducing, she was challenging. And Jehu looked up and shouted, "Who is on my side?" 2 or 3 eunuchs appeared at the window. "Throw her down!" And they threw her. Her body hit the wall. Blood splattered on the horses, and Jehu went in, ate and drank. When he sent for the body for burial, the dogs had already devoured everything except the skull, the feet, and the palms of the hands. Second Race 9:36. Exactly as Elijah had said. If this story is impressing you, leave a like for this video to reach more people. Jehu eliminated the entire house of Ahab. He killed Ahab's 70 sons in Samaria. Their heads were piled in 2 heaps at the city entrance. He exterminated the Baal worshippers in a calculated trap. He invited everyone to a great sacrifice in the temple of Baal. And when they were inside, he sent soldiers to massacre everyone. He destroyed the temple and turned it into a latrine. 2 Kings 10:27. But Jehu did not abandon the golden calves. He destroyed Baal, kept Jeroboam. He eliminated the foreign god, preserved the domestic sin, and the north continued to fall. After Jehu, 4 generations of his dynasty reigned, exactly what God promised as a reward for the destruction of Ahab's house. But each generation was worse. Jehu's grandson, Jehoash, stole the treasures from the temple in Jerusalem. His great-grandson, Jeroboam II, presided over a period of economic prosperity that masked total spiritual rot. It was during the reign of Jeroboam II that Amos prophesied. A shepherd from Tekoa, in the south, sent to the north with a message no one wanted to hear. You crush the poor. You sell the righteous for silver, and the needy for a pair of sandals. Your religious festivals make me sick. Your offerings empty noise. Amos 5:21-23. I despise your feast days. Take away from me the noise of your songs. But let justice run down like water, and righteousness like a mighty stream. Hosea prophesied at the same time with a message different in form, but identical in urgency. God told Hosea to marry a prostitute named Gomer. She betrayed him repeatedly. He sought her back. The whole relationship was a living metaphor. Israel was Gomer. God was the betrayed husband who insisted on loving. Hosea 11:8. How can I give you up, Ephraim? How can I hand you over, Israel? My heart churns within me. Even with judgment coming, God's heart was broken. If these words touched you, comment, God is faithful. Judgment came from Assyria, the most brutal empire of the ancient world. The Assyrians did not just conquer, they terrorized, they impaled prisoners alive, they flayed kings and hung their skin on the walls. And they had a policy of mass deportation that no empire before them had practiced on that scale. In 722 BC, after a 3-year siege, Samaria fell. Shalmaneser V began the siege. Sargon II finished it. 2 Kings 17:6 records. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria took Samaria and carried Israel away into Assyria. Sargon's records, found in the ruined Khorsabad in modern Iraq, claim he deported 27,290 people. But the Bible indicates the deportation was much broader. Entire families were uprooted from their lands and redistributed throughout the Assyrian Empire. Hala, Haber, the river Gozan, and the cities of the Medes, places thousands of kilometers from home, and in their place, Assyria brought settlers from other conquered nations, from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim. 2 Kings 17:24. These settlers mixed with the Israelites who stayed. They married each other. They fused their gods with the God of Israel. And this mixture produced the Samaritans, a people the southern Jews would despise for centuries. 10 tribes, scattered across the Assyrian Empire, diluted among foreign nations. This is the event that generated one of the greatest questions in history, the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Lost, in part. The northern tribes never returned as organized units. They never rebuilt their territories. Reuben, Simeon, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Ephraim, and Manasseh as political entities ceased to exist. But lost does not mean extinct. Individuals from all these tribes had already migrated south over the centuries. 2 Chronicles 15:9 mentions that people from Ephraim, Manasseh, and Simeon settled in Judah because they saw that God was with King Asa. 2 Chronicles 30:11 records that some from Adar, Manasseh, and Zebulun humbled themselves and came to Jerusalem for the Passover celebrated by Hezekiah. The blood of the 10 tribes did not disappear. It diluted into Judah. It mixed into the diaspora communities. It lost the tribal label, but not the Israelite identity. While the north was disappearing, Judah survived, but not by its own merit. 2 Kings 17:18-19 makes sure to warn, Judah also did not keep the commandments of the Lord their God. The difference between north and south was not morality. It was the promise. God's covenant with David worked like a steel cable, holding up a bridge about to fall. And the king who most tested that cable was Hezekiah. When Sennacherib, the Assyrian king, invaded Judah in 701 BC, after already having destroyed the north, he conquered 46 fortified cities of Judah. The reliefs from Sennacherib's palace in Nineveh, now in the British Museum, show the fall of Lachish in sculptural detail, prisoners being impaled, families marching into exile, Assyrian soldiers scaling walls with battering rams. Sennacherib besieged Jerusalem. He sent his official, Rabshakeh, to shout in Hebrew before the walls, a deliberate psychological warfare. No God has saved any nation from my hand. What makes you think your God will be different? Hezekiah did something no northern king ever did. He entered the temple, spread out Sennacherib's threatening letter before God, and prayed. Isaiah sent the answer. God would fight for Jerusalem. 2 Kings 19:35. That night, the angel of the Lord struck 185,000 Assyrian soldiers. In the morning, they were all corpses. Sennacherib returned to Nineveh and never attacked Jerusalem again. His own sons assassinated him years later inside the temple of his god. Archaeology confirms that Sennacherib never claimed the conquest of Jerusalem in his annals. A deafening silence for a king who detailed every victory. Judah survived, but survival bought time, not redemption, because after Hezekiah came Manasseh, 55 years of idolatry, child sacrifice, and innocent blood. 2 Kings 21:16 says he filled Jerusalem with blood from one end to the other, and after Manasseh came one last chance. Josiah ascended the throne at 8 years old. At 16, he began to seek God. At 20, he began to purify Judah from pagan altars. At 26, during a renovation of the temple, the high priest Hilkiah found something in the walls, the book of the law, probably Deuteronomy, possibly the entire Torah. The fact that the book had been lost inside the temple itself says everything about the spiritual state of the nation. When Josiah heard the words read aloud, he tore his robes, because the book described the curses that would fall on Israel if it disobeyed, and Judah had done every one of the forbidden things. The prophetess Huldah confirmed judgment would come, but not in Josiah's days because of his repentant heart. Josiah celebrated the greatest Passover since the days of Samuel. He destroyed altars, burned the bones of pagan priests, and tore down the sacred poems. 2 Kings 23:25 says that before him there was no king like him, who turned to the Lord with all his heart, and with all his soul, and with all his might. And after him no one like him arose. But Josiah died young, at 39, trying to block Pharaoh Necho in the valley of Megiddo. An arrow hit him, and with him died the last hope for reform. After Josiah, 4 kings, 3 sons and a grandson, reigned for a total of 22 years, each one worse than the last. And now the predator was no longer Assyria, which had fallen in 612 BC when Nineveh was destroyed. The new empire was Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar. In 605, he defeated Egypt at Carchemish and became the lord of the Middle East. In 597, he invaded Jerusalem for the first time and took King Jehoiakim, 10,000 captives, and all the treasures of the temple. Among the deportees was a young priest named Ezekiel, and probably a teenager named Daniel. Zedekiah, the last king, was placed on the throne as a puppet, but he rebelled, and Nebuchadnezzar returned. In 586 BC, after an 18-month siege that caused famine so extreme that mothers ate their own children, Lamentations 4:10 records this, the walls of Jerusalem were breached. Zedekiah tried to flee at night through the plains of Jericho. He was captured. They took him to Nebuchadnezzar at Riblah. The last thing Zedekiah saw with his own eyes were his sons being executed before him. Then they put out his eyes. 2 Kings 25:7. Solomon's temple was burned to its foundations, the bronze pillars, the stands, the bronze sea, all broken into pieces and carried to Babylon. The walls of Jerusalem demolished, the population deported. 2 Kings 25:12 says that Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, left only the poorest of the land to be vine dressers and farmers. The city that David conquered, that Solomon glorified, that Hezekiah defended, was ash. And with it, the unified monarchy, the temple, the functional priesthood, the territorial identity of the tribes, all was gone. But not the promise. Jeremiah, who had prophesied the destruction and wept more than any other prophet, also delivered the promise of restoration. Jeremiah 29:10. After 70 years are completed at Babylon, I will visit you and perform my good word toward you, and cause you to return to this place. 70 years. An entire generation would be born and die in exile, but the return would come. And it came. In 539 BC, Cyrus the Persian conquered Babylon without a battle. He diverted the Euphrates River and entered through the dry passage under the walls. In the first year of his reign, he issued a decree that Ezra 1-2-3 records, "The Lord God of heaven has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem. Who is among you of all his people? Let him go up." Isaiah had prophesied Cyrus's name 200 years before the decree in Isaiah 44:28. About 42,000 Jews returned in the first wave under Zerubbabel of David's royal line. They rebuilt the temple, smaller, poorer, without the Ark of the Covenant, which had disappeared and was never found again. Ezra 3:12 tells that the old men, who had seen the first temple, wept when they saw the second, out of sadness, not joy. But it was standing. The second temple was completed in 516 BC. And here, something fundamental changed. Those who returned from exile no longer identified themselves as 12 separate tribes. They were Yehudim, Jews. The name comes from Judah, because it was Judah that survived, Judah that maintained the identity, Judah that returned. The other tribes, their descendants were diluted into this Jewish identity. A man could have the blood of Benjamin, of Levi, of Simeon, but he was called a Jew. The faith. Tribal diversity was absorbed by collective identity. Luke 2:36 in the New Testament mentions Anna, from the tribe of Asher, one of the supposed lost tribes, living in Jerusalem in the time of Jesus. Paul identifies himself the Benjamite in Romans 11:1. James writes his letter to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad. The tribes did not disappear. They lost their geographical borders, but they survived as genealogical memory within the Jewish people. What began with 12 sons fighting in a tent in the desert ended with a people forged by fire. The tribes were God's experiment with diversity within unity, and the experiment revealed everything about human nature: jealousy, pride, betrayal, civil war, idolatry, but also courage, faith, sacrifice, and an inexplicable stubbornness to survive. From Reuben, who lost his birthright for a night in his father's bed, to Judah, who survived empires and gave his name to an entire civilization, each tribe carried a piece of history. And that history did not end in the ashes of Jerusalem. It ended, or rather continued, in a stable in Bethlehem, where a descendant of Judah was born, from the line of David, in a city so small that the prophet Micah almost apologized for mentioning it. Micah 5:2. "But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of you shall come forth to me the one to be ruler in Israel." The 12 tribes failed to be what God planned, but the plan never depended on their success. It depended on one. And that one came from the tribe that Jacob blessed on his deathbed with words no one understood for 1,700 years. "The scepter shall not depart from Judah until Shiloh comes." The scepter did not depart. And the history of the 12 tribes, with all its glories and all its horrors, was the path to him. If you made it this far, click on the next video appear on your screen. The story continues, and what comes next is even more impressive.